transpired since then for the book? Obviously, you've been working on it. What's come up since then?
Well, there were several steps to this. First, I worked on this from child to dawn, virtually. When I did the first book about James Sterling's work, I did some projects, but I mostly reworked the book, which is like a graphic copy of Corbusier's first volume of the Œuvre Complète. And you probably know the format, which is in album format. And Corbusier was not only a genius as artist, but also as graphic artist. And I think it's partially due to his interesting graphic vision that he became so famous. And because this Œuvre Complète, the books are laid out like a scenario for film. And you can follow, you enter this book and you see houses and town plans and so on, but you can always follow from one image leads to the next. It's like a real scenario, cinematic. And I always found that fascinating, and I designed Sterling's book first. It's called The Black Book, or a Hatje in Stuttgart, which is done in the same format, and I even imitated, I redrew a lot of Sterling's old drawings in my preferred Corbusier style. and the book is still it's actually very seductive. It follows that scenario, so that it's not just pictures and plans and so on, but you can follow this in a storyline. And it is that which kept on fascinating me all my life, and I tried to organize my own books that way. And but I was always wonder why at certain periods I would again pick up those books, even though it was completely against all the theories of construction and the territorial organization, and I find him scandalously superficial intellectually. But there was something always very powerful about his message, and I always wondered what. So I finally found out that, even when I was most against it, theoretically, and I went and there was always something. And so it reminded me, but was unable to really deal with it. And it reminded me when I saw a film called Babettes Feast, when a beautiful French lady, Stéphane Audin, is exiled in Denmark because she was objecting to Napoleon III. And she cooks, she's a great cook and very attractive woman. And one day she invites all the elders of the town, which is very sort of puritanical, religious group of people wearing black with funny hats and like the Quakers, and they're really Calvinist morality. She invites them to a dinner, and so they meet. The elders meet to discuss this. Should we accept this? Because there was like a danger to their own morality, and so they think, and then finally the elder says we should accept the invitation. And then one of the younger people asks him, but sir, what if we like it? What if we enjoy it? And the elder, he thinks, really like a priest, and says, we won't talk about it. And that is the kind of hypocrisy which is now invaded the art world with modernism. This hypocrisy that you no longer judge spontaneously and disinterestedly, but you judge with a grid, with an intellectual, metaphysical grid. Is this good for our final project? And so if you like it, you just won't talk about it. that is why you find that the people who detest us because of what we do, they could never say that we do nice buildings. They will say, "Oh well, it's not as bad as I thought," when they come. and you know, it's the same phenomenon which you had with classism, which after the war became banned as a language of totalitarian regimes, is that when people liked it, they couldn't talk about it because they felt embarrassed. There was a kind of moral conflict. Oh, these buildings by Speer, they are really, I mean, they got something, at least some of them, but we can't talk about it. And that is really confusing a major issue of that artistic judgment is, I think, is really inborn. And unless you deform it, it survives all kinds of political regimes, because aesthetic and artistic objects, productions, buildings, paintings, iconography, writing, graphics, landscaping, were part of all regimes before 1945 to give themselves a legal and an acceptable social setting, however tyrannical they were. You know. And that is why it is so, I think it's really a philosophic error to confuse artistic products with the regimes, because they are the only acceptable thing of most tyrannical regimes, because they survive them. And I'm also sure that, you know, Napoleon III, he was a cruel dictator. He had terrible influence over Mexico and the imperial policy in Algiers and so in Algeria and around the world. And he was a cruel dictator, but he was instrumental with Haussmann to make Paris into the seductive, incredibly, overwhelmingly beautiful, grand composition it is now. It was beautiful before, but was very differently beautiful. It was vernacularly beautiful with some monuments, and he turned the whole metropolis into a work of art. And so he should be honored as such, not because he was responsible in the end for the massacres which happened around the world and in France, but he left that. And that is important because it transcends his cruelty and it transcends the regime. It is of use to us. And the problem is with modernism that the Ville radieuse of Le Corbusier or the Plan Voisin for Paris would have served nobody. Not even the cruelest dictators used this kind of architecture, which he proposed for Paris, wiping out central Paris and replacing it with 24 glass towers and more to come later. And Speer told the story I told in the lecture that Hitler once came into his office and he had La Ville radieuse of Le Corbusier on the table. So Hitler leafed through this and said, unbrauchbar, it's unusable. Whereas Hitler, whatever, however cruel and however one of the greatest criminals of humankind ever produced, but he had a sense of urbanism and he had a sense of architecture. It's undeniable, which was very powerfully marked by his living in Vienna in the 1900s, early 1900s, yeah? And which was very strongly then under the spell of Otto Wagner. And the most powerful influence over modernism was Otto Wagner, who wrote the first book called Modern Architecture, where he stated that architecture of our time has to be modern. Now, Corbusier had a strange relationship, even though he recognized the greatness of Otto Wagner, the genius. He had a problem with Otto Wagner, which was personal. He tried to see Otto Wagner in 1907 or 8 when he first went there, when he was still a student writing a report for his school in La Chaux-de-Fonds. And Otto Wagner was impossible to meet. And because he was such an important figure, he would not meet a young Swiss coming there from Switzerland. And he was profoundly humiliated. And he tried to see Joseph Hoffmann, who had just built the Purkosdorf Sanatorium, which is Corbusier built in 1905 or 6. What Corbusier did 20 years later, he had already done. Or he had designed the bar, which was pure Corbusier, even free shape in that period. And the Wagner School, which was super famous, which not only influenced Europe, but even the Frank Lloyd Wright. And it's very clear that a lot of the modernism of Frank Lloyd Wright comes from Wagner, from the Wagner Schule, the Wagner School. You know. So Corbusier is a very interesting testimony and witness of his own period, because he always wrote. He wrote a lot, he drew a lot, and he was super gifted in drawing not only buildings but also women. And he was a mega talent, being now published. Maurice Culot is publishing all his drawings in 6 volumes, I think. And also his own letters. You know, he was a profuse letter writer, not only to his family but also to his friends. And so we have a lot of testimony, a lot of witnessing of what happened in the soul of this fellow, who was brought up as a traditionalist, as a sculptor for doing work on watches and so on. But in art school, which was very inspired by reform by William Morris and by German reform schools. So he was extremely aware of what was happening worldwide. And when he became modernist, it was all of a sudden. He was virtually a traditional designer. He even designed in the Otto Camillo Sitte fashion, the small village, up to 1917, I think. And then under the influence of the painter Amédée aux Enfants, he became modernist. He really became overnight a modernist, while he was a businessman during the First World War, dealing in coal. You know, he was a coal merchant to survive. He was not drafted because he was Swiss, but he lived in Paris. And so that was a bit of his background. He was a man who was extremely rooted in traditional design. He was very knowledgeable of reforms around Europe. He worked briefly for Behrens in Berlin. He traveled wide, you know, even to Turkey and so on. And so his buildings, when you see his buildings, even the modernist ones, you see there is something really in that. It's not the banal modernism which we knew after the Second World War, where your mind collapses looking at it. Your soul has nothing, but there's something to them. So I always wanted to find out what it was. Corbusier was also, he tried to prove that his buildings were, in a sense, in a classical spirit, by the proportions being controlled by diagonals, you know, the windows and the doors and the overall. But generally, I mean, when he formed himself largely, he was a lot in Munich. His best friend was famous music critic, friend of Gustav Mahler, homosexual who lived in, you know, then Munich was very liberal. He lived in a homosexual marriage in Munich in 1910, beginning of 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, which was very unusual. And Corbusier had a lot of exchanges with him. And Corbusier then, he followed Corbusier's drawings development, and they exchanged letters right into him becoming a modernist. And it was in Munich where there was the most, at that time, the most concentration of musical and architectural knowledge. And there was books produced in Germany which was called Handbuch der Architektur, Handbook of Architecture, Primer for Architecture, over 50 volumes on styles, on modes of construction, on iron construction, on concrete, on building types. And there's a whole volume by Tirsch on proportions, which is the key to Corbusier's knowledge of proportions, But when you study this book, you see that Corbusier didn't always get it. Because he has the diagonals going all over the place, whereas Kirsch is a great architect and a very systematic thinker, explaining why diagonals are important. Not just to go to the section, but it measures really the relation between two sides of a rectangle. And whatever the proportions are, if you order a building with the same diagonal, the openings and the volumes, it will be harmonious. It will go from the vernacular to the classical, but it will always be harmonious. And it explains the difference between vernacular aesthetics and classical aesthetics, which are not in contradiction, but they are complementary. They grow out of each other. So Corbusier had all these cultures because of his genius and intuition, artistic genius, was able in most of his buildings, not in his town planning, but to integrate this. So I thought, finally, why am I so fascinated with this? Because what I'm fascinated in the Villa Savoye is not so much that it is ship style, because I love ships, but that it is something which transcends the ship style. And so I thought if you can translate poetry from Chinese to French without losing too much of the message and the music and the poetry and the lyricism, you can certainly translate architecture, because architecture is universal language. It's a language which is understood without explanation. When you see a Chinese carpentry, you don't need a long explanation to understand how the pieces work, how the carpentry works structurally. And it's the same with our carpentry, or it's the same with our artwork and so on. So it's a language which is universal, is immediately understood, and that is why we are able, even having been brought up Catholics or Calvinists or European, we can appreciate Islamic architecture without converting to Islam, or why we can appreciate beauty of Thailandese vernacular without knowing anything about the country. Because when you see a beautiful Thailandese woman, you don't need to be told this is beautiful because it's Thailandese, and you need to understand that they are different from us. No. I remember always when I was in boarding school, we had the visit in our boarding school, which was a famous boarding school in Luxembourg, in Ashdana. We had the visit of King and Queen Sirikit of Thailand. And we stood there in line, all the boys. And when these people came past, the King and Queen of Thailand, we were all like, wow. There's something here. I mean, this is a beauty we have never seen. I mean, this is really unspeakable beauty, this Queen Sirikit. Not so much the king, but it is beauty which strikes across religions, across classes, across differences of culture and background and age. And that is why it is so important for us to insist on this, that beauty is the only thing which transcends political convictions. Political convictions, they go out of the window. Religious convictions, they divide humanity. But beauty will always be admired. And that is why, if there is something in Corbusier, we should recognize it and see what it is and what one can do with it. So I started then to try to, because I became really obsessed with this, but it didn't enter my metaphysical makeup, my theory about natural materials and so on. So I started sketching how these ideas in Le Corbusier, how they were found elsewhere. And then indeed, and they had sources in different countries, whether it was in Turkey or in France, in the mountains, or even in industrial construction, mostly in boats. And so I identified for Corbusier basically 4 styles. The classical vernacular, which went up to 1920, the ship style, which went up to 1930, the steel and glass, which went up to 1940, and then a short interruption where he worked for the Vichy regime and no work during the war. And when he came back from the war, he was commissioned, even though he had been basically a fascist. He was organized in a movement called, published books called Plans, which were openly fascist. Dr. Winter was a theoretician, and Corbusier was part of that group. And but the mystery is why, after the war, he got immediately the commission for the Unité in Marseille, which was his until then, his most important project, Unité d'habitation in Marseille, which has several hundred housing units and so on, and which was built. But the style was entirely new for Le Corbusier. The style was cast concrete, which he called béton brut, which then led to what was called by Rainer Panham, a book called New Brutalism, which started with Le Corbusier, but then had Sterling in it, and Ahrens and Korolek, and people of the 60s.
Yeah.
Why? I always asked him, I met him briefly when we worked on a book for Sterling together. I asked Rainer Panham, why do you call this New Brutalism? Because what's old brutalism? No. And he smiled. He had kind of mercurial, hermetic smile. He wouldn't explain. And then it was so obvious to me, was that the old brutalism was Organisation Tod, the Nazi defense works, headed by Albert Speer from 1942 onwards, to build the Atlantic Wall. The concrete aesthetic of Le Corbusier's post-war work is entirely and up to the detail influenced by the brutalism of the Organisation Tod, which is not written like Tod, but it means death, Tod, death. But Tod was an engineer who was the head of the organization before Speer. So it is very interesting that Corbusier was an organized fascist, never denied it, and there are books about it. He gets the most important job to set the new politics of construction in France. Is promoted then by Claudius Petit. Claudius Petit was the head of the resistance, resisting Vichy, and he became one of the most important protectors of Le Corbusier after the war. He commissioned him the building in Firminy-Vert, Firminy, where Corbusier built his last church and so on. So there's a strange continuity and a strange mix between Vichy and what was developed in Vichy for mass housing, but they had also a reactionary group which was strongly regionalist, which was actually very interesting. But it's so strange that the most powerful, and why Corbusier left Vichy, because he couldn't do what he wanted there. He left in 1943, I think. But he formed a group which then formulated the Charter of Athens, definitive text of the Charter of Athens, which became the fundamental text for post-war planning, which led straight to post-war modernism, new towns, the zoning, universal zoning, with strong roots in fascism, except the style. But the style was still could be attributed to the Nazi system because they built the Atlantic thousands, tens of thousands of forced labor, French and Polish and from across Europe had to build this French Atlantic Wall. Hundreds and hundreds of bunkers and submarine bunkers in Bordeaux and in Nantes and so on. So all this has not been worked up by architectural historians. By Pevsner, who claims that modernism is the language of democracy and classism is the language of tyranny. And Pevsner said that any word about Nazism would be wasted. It's just rubbish of history, forgotten, best forgotten. And it's amazing that such superficial ideas could become so dominant in the post-war education administration, politics, and it's still reigning. It's dominating Europe. So Corbusier is a figure, Corbusier and Speer, that's why I occupy myself with it, because they are central figures. The people always say, my friends, why did you write about Palladio? Palladio is not in question. It's not practiced, but it's not forbidden morally,
yeah.
Because Speer was also inheritor. If you look at it, he was a particular talent, not only politically, but a genius of organization, but also architecture. When you follow his drawings, and I looked through thousands of his drawings, he was an enormous talent. And when you look at how he developed from a rather weak education under Tessenhoff, which was mostly vernacular. He was an assistant of Heinrich Tessenhoff at the University at Technical High School in Berlin, where you didn't learn about classicism. Tessenhoff was basically a vernacular. He wrote about the rebirth of craftsmanship, how important it was for society, and but nothing about classicism, nor about industry. And so it is so strange that both Corbusier was brought up as traditionalist, with an aesthetic feeling not only for art and painting and beauty in the fine arts, but also in music. His mother was a pianist, and he was a music critic when he worked for, he was a music critic when he worked for Behrens. He was incredibly, very much interested in music. So he was a man who was rooted in this traditional aesthetic and literature. You know, his preferred literature was Homer and so on. And Speer too, who was brought up as a traditionalist. And then these figures betray their own background, their own beliefs, not only religious, but also particularly aesthetic. And they are figures who are very, very comparable, even though their products are very different. And Speer confirmed that after the war, if they had won the war, I said it the other day, and Nazi architecture would have become exactly like what happened in the Soviet Union. When Stalin died, and that generation of architects, modernism became the dominant system. All that, and it's this singular, extraordinary unity between all these systems who are dominated by an industrial spirit of industrial progress, that the aesthetics are in the end the scapegoat. And because one says that if we follow this great scheme of progress, beauty will be the outcome. And it worked with Corbusier because he was super talent. And so, however brutal certain aspects of his buildings, like the Unité in Marseille, is, I mean, the northern facade is just a killer. It's a blank facade, and behind there are corridors who should have windows. You know? And there are long corridors, 150-meter long corridors, who should have a window to look. No, he walled them, because it was like the sun is dictating, and the sun turns on two sides, basically, like two sides, basically, and therefore the north is condemned. So all facades of his Villa Radieuse would have northern facades without windows. I mean, insane. Those are aspects which one should really forget, but still within the Unité, when I saw it first, I took my parents and we were all shocked out of our own minds. And how awful is this? How is this possible? My mother said, "What? This is, you admire this? I mean, it's a prison. I mean, it's horrible." And I thought, poor mommy, she doesn't understand the beauty of our time. But I was also shocked. Huh? So then I rejected. But now when I go back, I still see the quality. And particularly the roof is just fantastic. I mean, it's as good as the part in the Acropolis in Athens. And so there are certain aspects of Corbusier which are really, they are of extraordinary quality, but that doesn't mean that you accept the whole theory or the whole personage as And that is, I think, the real error of modern historiography, that once they historicize a person, he becomes divine, untouchable, and you don't criticize anymore, because that is Corbusier, he's a genius. So whether he was a fascist or whether he designed town destroying, Plan Voisin destroying the center of Paris, well, you know, you don't make an omelette without breaking eggs. That's the kind of Stalinist response. Sterling, he traveled a lot to Algiers at one point, and he came once back shocked. He was a man who was not easily shocked. And he talked about this, you know, that the man always took him in Oran through the main school. The building sites were run by Japanese in green drill dress. So he asked the mayor, why don't you employ your own people? And the mayor was a good socialist, you know, communist, whatever they were in Algiers at the time. He said, well, Mr. Sterling, to build socialism, we have to sacrifice 2 or 3 generations. Mentality. And that was the mentality which guided not only the socialists, but also the National Socialists. You know. And then, because when they become racist, they think they make scapegoats, and they find we can only win by, we have to do the sacrifice to kill the Jews because nobody else does it. And they are the damnation of reverse. So they do it even, you know, according to a rational scheme. And that is where the problem lies. You know? And so Corbusier is entirely part of that mindset. That, but he was a genius, and he produced some really good work. And so I thought, if you can translate it, we'll translate it. So for years, I did drawings translating the most fascinating Villa Chaudano. I had students do this. The Villa Savoie went at Yale. We had the Villa Savoie in a Shaker village in Massachusetts. Translated into Shaker wooden balloon frame aesthetics, and it really became beautiful. It really worked. And funnily, I had the jury. I had Vincent Scully on the jury, who was he was always very sympathetic, particularly also to Andres Duany and Liz Peter-Zyberg, and to the whole new urbanist movement. He always said he was a bit scared of me. I don't know why. But he got more and more irritated. And they had kept, the last student was a Chinese, a beautiful boy. I mean, he was incredibly tall, unusual for Chinese, called Mr. Ng. Real super talent. And he took the Maison de Verre of Charot and Byfoot, you know, in Paris. You know the Maison de Verre?
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Sorry. Just checking across. But he took the Maison de Verre and translated it into Chinese carpentry, with Chinese carpentry. And because at Yale there was a famous teacher in the 60s who gave all his treatises on Chinese carpentry. He was of Chinese origin, to the Yale Library. So we had all these fantastic books on Chinese carpentry. And he translated all these he brought these all onto the computer and could manipulate them. And he transformed the Maison de Verre without any loss of spirit, transparency, openness, into Chinese carpentry. It was fantastic. And when Vincent Scully saw this, he got really irritated. He said, "Why do you do this? I mean, why? Just leave them alone. Leave these things alone." I said, "But why? I mean, I kept this man just because he's the most brilliant. He's fantastic talent. Can't you see? I mean, he got irritated. He walked out. He got so irritated. Vincent Scully was the most tolerant person to be met, but still the background. You know, don't touch those pieces. They are sacred. They are divine. Because it demonstrated something that the quality, if there is quality in Maison de Verre, it has been around forever. You found it in Japan. We took the, I had a Japanese student, he took the Barcelona pavilion Miss van der Rohe's masterpiece, and it is a masterpiece. I never liked it until I went there with my brother. We were in a taxi in Barcelona, and just driving to the airport, we said, why not let's have a look at, they just rebuilt Barcelona. And we stood there, really struck. It's a low building, it has nothing, but it's unbelievably powerful. I mean, this was a genius, this guy. But then the genius left him, unfortunately, in the 30s. I mean, he went from great architecture, beautiful buildings before, particularly classical buildings, incredible in Babelsberg and Berlin. And then he just went to zero. And it is that which unfortunately became the official style of the Marshall Plan after the war. But we took the Barcelona pavilion, this beautiful, delicate masterpiece, to Katsura in Kyoto, you know, the famous Katsura Gardens, and it became a tourist information center translated into Japanese style, and it was fantastic.
Did you want to talk? I think one of the things that's come out of your talk is the self-censorship that modernism has had on the Corbusier side, but also that our culture has had with Hitler and Speer on the Western culture side. And if you talk of, you mention Hitler, you're an apologist for it. It's a very dangerous sort of censorship.
Yeah, because you are supposed, you think that Hitler had judgment, so you are a Holocaust denier, you know. I mean, it's
yes,
a catastrophic mistake to do that. It's a philosophic mistake. And grown-ups shouldn't do these mistakes because it really reduces accusations to nothing. And then the real criminals, they have free hand because accusations become superficial, so they don't count. Right. No, because maybe just to conclude as an introduction to Corbusier, is that I worked for a lifetime until 2015 on the drawings and doing not only translation of buildings, but also of projects like Pessac, you know, the housing in Pessac, showing how even doing basically traditional translations, but Pessac had great charm in style and in scale. Typology, interesting typological diversity of building, 5 different building types, but he all lined them up in a suburban fashion. And I transformed this into a real place, you know, with the town hall square and the church square and so on, and doing it in the Corbusier style. But even with the Corbusier style, you could have done a proper town, and then translating it in traditional Aquitaine style or classical style of the Bordeaux area. But then I work a lot with Jamshid Seperi, and both in Rome and in Romania, and we did many projects together. And when he saw these drawings, he started, even without I asking him, he started translating them in 3D, in digital fashion. And I found, and I didn't employ him. He does it because out of fun, but then it becomes a real serious project, because you know, a sketch or a hand drawing leaves a lot of options open, and you can dream to perfection. But then the digital work needs to be perfect, what you see, because otherwise it's just awful. And so he sent me these, which were, I mean, so good that I want, you know, and he started, what are your comments? So I started commenting, and this became now, we're now in the 4th year of this. And then he also, Jamshid started doing Chandigarh, which I had not really seen as a major project because it's urbanistically. I had done that with a student, Rodrigo de Arte, which I used to publish, how to urbanize Chandigarh. With the modules of Corbusier for the town center, we introduced them in the capital, and realizing in 3 dimensions what Corbusier drew as 2 dimensions, because he had like 2-dimensional plan, a gardening plan, and then a paving plan, and then buildings in different locations. And I said, I did this while I was still working for Sterling, because Chandigarh became an obsession. And I said, bloody hell, this is a town plan. I mean, this could be is correct as a town plan. Camillo Zitte could subscribe to this if you realize the green patches become buildings between his monumental buildings. And the green patches are the vernacular, they become just utilitarian buildings. And the monumental buildings, they are the monuments. And Rodrigo did this thesis for the EA out of this, and it was brilliant. But then, you know, I thought that is done, and I went to see Chandigarh, and I thought it's good as it is. And I understood Chandigarh finally when I was there, because Chandigarh, these huge voids between which people generally condemn, is also poetically and lyrically extremely interesting. You feel the poetry of when you are on an airfield, you know. An airfield, you are between these vast hangars and open airfield and landscape and aeroplanes. And it's extraordinarily beautiful spectacle and poetic. And actually, some of his buildings, they look like hangars. I mean, the Justice Palace is like a huge hangar. It's like a big, you know, arch, thing stuck in it. And so I thought, maybe it's not such a good idea to touch the capital, we leave that. But then with Jamshid, I had done an exercise with students at Yale that I was always fascinated by the Secretariat, because Secretariat is, the whole building, 250 meters long, is like a lexicon of Corbusian architecture, mostly of balconies and brise-soleil. So I turned this into a real lexicon, and I said to students at Yale, we had like 2-day exercise, put this on the computer and make a street. I cut the building in 50 blocks, you know, vertically and horizontally, and composed a rough urban scheme. It really worked. The only thing missing was the tower. And the work they did in 2 days was so impressive that we thought, I mean, this is worth pursuing, but the students didn't have time. So Jamshid started to really put this on the computer, and since then we have been working on this now for 3 years, and it's now nearly complete. It's a whole town, you can walk through it, and which proves that even with that very reduced, and I added very few things, I always thought the big mistake of Corbusier was that he didn't have a vernacular in Chandigarh for the common buildings, except the town center module, but which was monumental grid 5 by 5 meters and 5 meters high, which you can't use for single houses. He left that to his to Jane Drew and Maxwell Fry and to his cousin Pierre Jeanneret, and they are very poor buildings. I mean, really mediocre. And he couldn't care less. I think he just was not his. He wanted to do his monumental buildings. But what we are proving is that even with his own lexicon, you can design a beautiful town, articulate with silhouette, you know, the low fabric, monumental buildings coming up, and then with local scale and grand scale, big avenues, and then intimate streets. It was just a problem of theory. It just couldn't. No, and that needed to be done even for modernism to civilize itself. So I think it's also a message for modernism: do your work, do your homework. You know, you just use fragments of something which you can't even call language. I mean, modernism is in fact never reached what classicism did, because classicism is the artistic language, monumental language, and poetical language of vernacular building. Vernacular building is purely tectonic logic of using natural materials to build permanent, semi-permanent forms, whether it's earth or mud or brick or stone or wood. Whereas modernism is a kind of vernacular which never developed the lexicon. And that could be done. There were some people in the Corbusier school, Mies forget it. I mean, they just knew how to do a grid facade, which is very boring and without variety. But in the Corbusier school, there were people like in Duarte in Chile or Atelier 5 in Switzerland. Richard Meier to some degree, Michael Graves in his first phase, he was really a very good Corbusian modernist and showed real talent. I don't like his postmodern work, but he was real poetic. But the problem is that they didn't care about durability. And all these, most of Michael's early work is not made for to stand under the sun or under rain and snow. And they're conceived to be built in a museum, but not in the real world. And instead of seriously, the New York Five, instead of seriously advancing, completing the language of Corbusier, they just played a bit with it. And then when Richard Meier does the very large buildings, he loses completely language. And that is why I called the book Le Corbusier after Le Corbusier translated, completed, corrected and completed, because it's a language which needs to be completed also by testing it with with weather and.
I think that's a good place for us to stop.
I need to have a rest.
Well, but thank you.